Today, Korea stands as a geopolitical scar on the face of the earth, a nation cleaved in two, frozen in time along a militarized frontier known only as the DMZ. To the south, the Republic of Korea, a powerhouse of innovation, a dazzling, defiant democracy, giving the world everything from hyperspeed technology to the global phenomenon of K-pop. To the north, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, a hermetically sealed totalitarian state defined by isolation, military parades, and the cult of a hereditary dynasty. But look closer. This isn't just a political border, it is a profound wound running through a single ancient people. How did one unified civilization, one history, one language, one bloodline become two worlds separated by razor wire, landmines, and a generation of irreconcilable ideologies? How did the fate of a resilient kingdom that resisted foreign influence for centuries get shattered by a line drawn on a map by distant men? To understand this deep fissure, this ongoing tragedy, we cannot start in the Cold War. We must rewind back to a time when Korea was known as the Hermit Kingdom, a sovereign nation yet coveted by giants. We must travel to the tumultuous 19th century when the shadows of imperial ambition first began to fall across the peninsula. For centuries, the Korean state under the Joseon dynasty maintained a precarious balance, proudly independent, yet often functioning as a tributary to the mighty Qing dynasty of China. They sought isolation, believing their strength lay in keeping the outside world at bay. This was the strategy of Daewon-gun, the de facto ruler in the 1860s. His policy was simple and brutally enforced: violent rejection of the West. Any foreign ship landing on Korean shores was met with hostility. But the world was changing. The age of isolation was over, replaced by an era of rapacious expansion. And the closest, most determined power was not from Europe, but from their island neighbor, Japan. Japan, freshly modernized and eager to assert itself as the dominant power in Asia, saw Korea not as a peer, but as a crucial stepping stone, a dagger pointed at the heart of their own nation should it fall to a rival. Initial attempts at diplomacy were stonewalled. The Daewon-gun stood firm. Yet the moment the Daewon-gun relinquished his group in 1873, the geopolitical floodgates burst open. Japan did not send diplomats, they sent warships. Under the barrel of a cannon, Korea was coerced into signing the Ganghwa Treaty in 1876, opening up several ports to Japanese trade. It was a humiliating, unequal treaty, and it instantly signaled Korea was no longer master of its own destiny. This single act of aggression set off a chain reaction, dragging the peninsula into the vortex of great power rivalry. Qing China, viewing Korea as its traditional sphere of influence, reacted immediately, stationing troops and asserting its own authority. Korea was now a geopolitical pawn, squeezed by two colossal competing forces. Over the next decade, foreign powers, the United States, Britain, Russia, Germany, all demanded and received treaties, carving up Korea's sovereignty piece by piece. The Hermit Kingdom was dragged, unwilling and unprepared, onto the world stage. Internally, the ruling elite split. The radicals, who saw Japan as the model for swift, complete modernization, and the moderates, who sought a slower, more balanced approach. This internal chaos was the perfect fuel for external manipulation. A pro-Japanese coup in 1884 was almost immediately put down by Chinese troops. War was avoided only by a fragile agreement, the Lee-Ito Convention, for both Japan and China to withdraw their forces. But peace in this new, contested land was never meant to last. It was merely a pause before the next inevitable clash for ultimate domination. And when it came, it would fundamentally change the destiny of the Korean people forever. The quiet agreement between Japan and China to withdraw their forces lasted barely 10 years. The prize, control of the Korean peninsula, was too great. The struggle for mastery culminated in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894-1895, a resounding victory for a modernized, militarized Japan. The resulting Treaty of Shimonoseki was unambiguous. Japan gained authority over Korea, effectively signaling the collapse of China's centuries-old suzerainty. Korea was now unequivocally within the Japanese sphere. But the moment Japan claimed dominance, a new, massive shadow appeared on the horizon: Imperial Russia. Russia, seeking desperately to expand its influence into East Asia, refused to stand by. Backed by France and Germany, Russia pressured Japan to return territories to China. This external pressure gave the Korean court a fleeting moment of anti-Japanese confidence. That confidence had a horrific price. In 1895, the symbol of Korean resistance, Queen Min, was brutally assassinated by Japanese agents. This was not just a political killing, it was a targeted act of terror intended to decapitate the Korean resistance and signal the new, brutal reality of Japanese intent. King Gojong, fearing for his life, fled to the Russian legation, seeking diplomatic protection and granting concessions to Moscow in exchange for survival. The stage was set for the next cataclysm, the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905. Though Korea declared neutrality, Japan, through military pressure, forced an agreement allowing them unrestricted use of Korean territory for the war effort. Japan was victorious again, and the ensuing Treaty of Portsmouth, mediated by the United States, formalized what the bullets had decided. Japan's paramount interest in Korea was acknowledged by the world. The path to annexation was now wide open. This was a campaign not of swift conquest, but of gradual, meticulous erosion of sovereignty. Desperate, the now Emperor Gojong sent a secret emissary to the 1907 International Peace Conference at The Hague, hoping to plead Korea's case to the world powers. It was a last, heroic, and utterly futile gesture. The international community, already entangled in its own imperial webs, simply looked away. Japan's response was swift and punitive. Emperor Gojong was coerced to abdication. The Korean army was forcibly disbanded. And in 1910, the final crushing blow: Japan formally annexed Korea. The next 35 years were not merely an occupation. They were a systematic, brutal attempt at cultural erasure. The Japanese colonial administration targeted the very soul of the Korean nation. Freedom of speech, press, and assembly were abolished. Korean private schools were closed, replaced by a system that promoted the Japanese language and agenda while deliberately excluding Korean history and identity. But the most profound devastation came through economic exploitation. The Japanese administration began a massive land seizure program. They issued proclamations that any land without individual registration would be forfeited. Forests and farmland communally owned by villages, lacking single-owner deeds, were simply declared state property, then sold off cheaply to Japanese settlers and companies. Korean farmers, driven from their ancestral lands, were rendered tenants or worse, forced into mass emigration to Siberia, Manchuria, and Hawaii. The rice, the staple of the Korean people, was systematically exported to Japan to fuel its industrialization, forcing Koreans to subsist on cheap imported grains. Their bodies starved, their spirit was constantly suppressed. But a people's identity is not so easily extinguished. The death of the former Emperor Gojong in 1919 became the rallying cry. As a symbol of enduring independence, the entire nation went into collective mourning, which erupted on March 1st into the March 1st movement, nationwide, peaceful anti-Japanese rallies. The Korean Declaration of Independence was read aloud in Seoul, and millions demanded self-determination. The colonial powers' reaction? Brutal suppression. Tens of thousands arrested, killed, or wounded. The iron fist was clenched, but the spirit, once awakened, could not be subdued. The resistance simply went underground, and then abroad, to the safe harbor of Shanghai, where independence leaders formed a Korean provisional government. They would wait, and they would plan, until the moment of the colonial power's demise. As the world plunged into the Second World War, the Japanese grip on Korea tightened into a desperate existential squeeze. The cultural assault intensified.
Koreans were forced to adopt Japanese names. They were compelled to worship at Shinto shrines. Korean language publications and academic studies were banned. Every aspect of national identity was targeted for obliteration. Worse still, Korea became a crucial resource for the imperial war machine. Korean men were drafted into the Japanese army. Thousands were forced to work in factories, mines, and military bases. And, in one of the war's darkest chapters, thousands of Korean women were coerced into sexual servitude as the so-called comfort women. This was not just colonial rule. It was a devastating campaign of human exploitation. But overseas, the flame of resistance still burned. The Korean Provisional Government, having relocated to Chongqing in southwestern China, formally declared war against Japan in December 1941. They formed the Korean Restoration Army, fighting alongside the Allied forces, committing to the long, bloody conflict that would eventually decide their fate. Finally, in August 1945, the moment arrived. Japan surrendered, marking the end of 35 years of the most brutal foreign domination a nation could endure. The Korean people celebrated wildly. They were liberated. Their nation, surely, would be restored. But the victory was a mirage. The great powers, the United States, Great Britain, and China, had pledged Korean independence in due course back in the 1943 Cairo Declaration. But what did in due course truly mean? The provisional government's request for clarity went unanswered. No specific plan existed. In the chaotic final days of the war, the powerful nations scrambling to define the New World Order were more concerned with spheres of influence than with the self-determination of a long-suffering people. At the Yalta Conference, President Roosevelt proposed a temporary four-power trusteeship for Korea, involving the US, Britain, China, and crucially, the USSR. The USSR, having been encouraged by the US to enter the war against Japan, had already pledged support for Korean independence. On August 11, 1945, just days after the atomic bombs fell, American planners drafted General Order No. 1. This document, conceived hastily and without consultation with any Korean leader, would change the trajectory of the peninsula forever. The order designated that all Japanese forces north of the 38th parallel would surrender to the Soviets. All Japanese forces south of that line would surrender to the Americans. The Soviet army was already pouring into the Northern Territory. The Americans arrived a few weeks later in the south. And just like that, with a single arbitrary stroke of a pen, Korea was split into two zones. The 38th parallel was intended only as a temporary military demarcation line, a convenient administrative tool for disarming the Japanese. But in the emerging brutal climate of the Cold War, a temporary line becomes a permanent ideological border.
This division was deeply controversial. Was it a pragmatic measure to prevent the Soviets from occupying the entire peninsula? Or was it a cynical act of great power politics, sacrificing a unified Korea to the interests of two emerging superpowers? In the North, the Soviets immediately began consolidating power. They installed an administration aided by expatriated Korean communists. In October 1945, a figure arrived in Pyongyang, instantly hailed as a national hero, a decorated major in the Soviet Red Army, Kim Il-sung. In the South, the Americans refused to recognize the existing local Korean political organizations or the newly proclaimed People's Republic of Korea. The U.S. military government, asserting itself as the only legitimate authority, instead set up its own institutions, attempting to bridge the gap between their liberal democratic ideals and the volatile political reality on the ground. The initial promise of a 5-year trusteeship by the U.S., U.K., and USSR sparked immediate violence and protests from Koreans, who viewed it as a continuation of colonial rule under new masters. Korea had traded one foreign ruler for two, and the price of their liberation was the fracture of their nation. The promise of a temporary demarcation line quickly dissolved into the rigidity of global ideological warfare. By 1946, the Soviet zone in the north was rapidly being transformed.
Moscow didn't install a direct military government, but rather established the Provisional People's Committee for North Korea, placing a trusted Soviet-backed Korean communist at its head, Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung's political ascent was swift and absolute. With the full backing of the Soviet authorities, he began a process of consolidation, building a monolithic communist-controlled government. By February 1947, a legislative body was formed, setting the stage for a state built on the principles of Soviet Marxism-Leninism. The Soviets had the advantage of an immediate, unified vision and a single, strong leader to rally around. Their policies focused on land reform and nationalization, appealing directly to the poor and disenfranchised in the North, a powerful call after years of Japanese exploitation. In the American zone south of the 38th parallel, the situation was the very definition of political chaos. Numerous political parties, monarchists, nationalists, socialists, and Democrats sprang up, all striving for self-governance, but deeply divided on the means. The U.S. military government struggled to impose a coherent structure, often favoring the anti-communist establishment elements. The Americans chose to back the staunchly anti-communist former president of the Provisional Korean government, Syngman Rhee. Rhee, having spent years in exile, represented a powerful, recognizable nationalist figure. Yet his authoritarian tendencies and refusal to compromise would become a central problem for the democratic ideals the U.S. was attempting to foster. The attempts between the U.S. and the USSR to agree on a path to a unified, independent Korea went nowhere. Each side was determined to ensure any united government would reflect their ideology and their leader. The talks collapsed, having achieved nothing but the deepening of the ideological divide. In November 1947, the United States, recognizing the stalemate, proposed a resolution to the United Nations. General elections should be held across the entire peninsula under UN supervision. The U.S. knew the Democratic South would agree. The Soviets, who feared losing an election in the more populated South, immediately barred the United Nations Temporary Commission from entering the North.
The die was cast. The path to unification through diplomacy was officially dead. The South went ahead with elections. On August 15, 1948, the Republic of Korea, ROK, was formally proclaimed, with Syngman Rhee as its first president. The UN General Assembly declared the ROK the only lawful government in Korea. A democracy, however fledgling and imperfect, had been born under the American August. The North responded in kind. They held their own separate elections in August, and in September, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, was proclaimed, with Kim Il-sung appointed as its premier. It was instantly recognized by the Soviet Union as the only lawful government. The temporary military line was now cemented. Two entirely separate, ideologically opposed, and mutually hostile states had emerged from the shell of a single ancient kingdom. The Korean people were no longer simply North and South. They were citizens of two competing systems, armed and backed by the world's two new superpowers. The dream of independence, paid for in blood and suffering, had been twisted into the reality of permanent partition. The stage was set for the next inevitable chapter. With two antagonistic states, each claiming jurisdiction over the entire peninsula, armed to the teeth and staring across a line that was never meant to hold, the question was no longer if they would fight, but when. The consequences of that arbitrary line drawn in 1945 were about to be realized in one of the 20th century's most brutal, defining conflicts. The split was over, but the war of unification was just around the corner. The political split of 1948, cemented by the withdrawal of both U.S. and Soviet forces, was simply the prelude to disaster. Neither Syngman Rhee in the South nor Kim Il-sung in the North accepted the 38th parallel as legitimate. Both were committed to the violent reunification of the peninsula under their respective flags. The spark was inevitable. On June 25, 1950, the North Korean People's Army, well-equipped and backed by Soviet armor, slammed across the 38th parallel, launching a full-scale invasion of the South. This was not a civil skirmish. It was the world's first major hot war of the Cold War era. The Soviet Union supported the North. The United States, under the banner of the United Nations, committed its forces to defend the South. The Korean War was a savage, brutal conflict that lasted 3 agonizing years, devastating the entire peninsula and costing millions of lives, both civilian and military. The front lines surged and collapsed, pushing almost to the edge of the peninsula only to be driven back. It became a punishing war of attrition, marked by vast casualties and an absolute humanitarian catastrophe. But in the end, the lines of battle settled back down, shockingly close to where they had started, the 38th parallel. In July 1953, an armistice was signed. An armistice, note, not a peace treaty. The war technically never ended. The truce simply established a demilitarized zone, DMZ, a 160-mile-long, 2.5-mile-wide buffer strip, more fortified than any border on Earth, essentially returning the nation to its pre-war divided state. The post-war path of the two Koreas diverged completely. South Korea, with massive U.S. and international support, navigated a treacherous path from authoritarianism and military rule, often facing political turmoil and violent repression, to a mature, vibrant democracy. Fueled by the economic miracle known as the Miracle on the Han River, the South transformed from one of the world's poorest countries to a global economic and cultural titan. Its citizens enjoy fundamental freedoms, free media, and a voice in their government.
North Korea, however, doubled down on isolation and autarky. Under Kim Il-sung, it consolidated into a hereditary dictatorship founded on the ideology of juche, or self-reliance, a state built around the cult of personality of the ruling Kim dynasty. Economic and political freedoms were utterly suppressed. The nation's resources were perpetually poured into maintaining a massive military and its nuclear weapons program, leaving its population in a state of chronic hardship and international isolation. 70 years after the armistice, the DMZ remains, a testament not only to the power of ideological divides, but to the tragic consequences of foreign intervention. What if the Allied powers had kept their promise and allowed the Koreans to form their own, unified, independent government immediately after 1945? Would a single, unified Korea have avoided both the war and the dictatorship that followed? Was the division inevitable, a necessary consequence of the Soviet-American rivalry? Or was it a colossal blunder born of geopolitical convenience and a profound lack of regard for a nation's sovereignty? The answer is buried beneath the layers of history, political intrigue, and the ongoing silence of the DMZ. But the history is clear. Korea was not born divided. It was a single, proud, and unified nation, forced open, contested by imperial powers, brutally colonized, and then, at the very moment of its liberation, carved in two by the hasty decree of distant nations prioritizing their own power struggle. And today, that line, that arbitrary 38th parallel, is the most heavily fortified border in the world, a permanent reminder of the price of great power politics on the destiny of a small nation. This history of Korea is not merely a tragedy of the past, it is a live, ongoing crisis. The fate of 80 million people still rests on the hope for or the dread of reunification. The division challenges us to look critically at the forces that shape global events. Is history controlled by the people who live it, or by the powers who draw the lines on the maps? Let me know what you think. Was the division truly unavoidable, given the global tensions of 1945? What are the biggest hurdles to reunification today? Share your thoughts and perspectives in the comments below. To get a deeper understanding of the entire history of this captivating yet tragic peninsula, check out our book, History of Korea, A Captivating Guide, available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. The links are in the description. If you found this investigative documentary captivating, please hit the like button, subscribe for more videos like this, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the hidden mysteries of history.